Into Tejas Network's latest earnings. Those Q2 FY25 numbers, the ones that have everyone talking. And we know you all are about getting to the good stuff quickly, so we're going to break down these earnings call transcripts, the statements. We even got our hands on the press release.
It's interesting. We actually have a bunch of different perspectives this time to piece together, right? Because we've got the earnings call, which is obviously the company's big picture, but then the hard numbers from the financial statements, and then what they want the world to see, the press release.
It's like having all sides of the story. And just a really quick reminder for anyone who might need it, Tejas Networks, they're the ones designing and making a lot of the internet and communication systems we're all using every day. They're part of that big Tata group, which, side note, is huge in India, and their reach is global, over 75 countries. Oh, and they just finished up a merger with Sankhya Labs. They do wireless solutions. Okay. But the real news here, Tejas Networks, record-breaking quarter.
No kidding. These numbers are really something else. Okay, so get this. Their net revenue, a massive Rs, 2,811 crore. We are talking about a 610% jump from last year. 610%. Profit before tax, R 411 crore. After-tax profit, R 275 crore. Oh, and the order book, a cool Rs, 4,845 crore. I mean, just massive growth.
Okay, so we're throwing around some huge numbers here, but what's the reason behind it all? Why the sudden growth spurt? Well, the earnings call transcript points to this major deal they snagged with BSNL. That's Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. For those who don't know, it's India's big telecom player. It's like they landed a starring role in a huge movie.
Yeah, and you can really see just how big this project is when you look at the financial statements. Yeah. Like just this quarter, Tejas shipped over 30,000, and that's just 4G sites to BSNL, which brings their total to over 58,000. But get this, they're expecting to keep that same pace for the next couple of quarters, maybe even ship more than 30,000 sites per quarter. We're talking about a rollout at a crazy fast pace.
It's ambitious, for sure, and it could mean a lot of money, especially since it sounds like BSNL is just getting started. They were talking about upping their game even more, making their network even denser, giving it a major upgrade, like switching from that old standard definition TV to that ultra high definition. That's the kind of difference we're talking about for their network and for everyone who uses BSNL.
It's a smart move, honestly. They're getting everything they can out of their current 4G system before making that jump to 5G.
So everything's coming up, Tejas Networks, right? Well, not so fast. The analysts on the earnings call brought up a really good point. Putting so much reliance on one client, even one as big as BSNL, is kind of risky, right? What happens when that contract is over? Can they really keep this up?
You hit the nail on the head. It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there. I think Tejas knows they can't just be a one-hit wonder. The earnings call did give us some hints about what they're doing to branch out, though, which is pretty interesting.
Let's talk about the future. What's next for Tejas? Well, remember how we were talking about BSNL and that massive 4G rollout? They're already thinking about taking it even further, expanding to over 120,000 sites. That means even more business for Tejas. And it gets better. They're already doing some test runs with Tejas for 5G upgrades on their current 4G sites. Can you imagine if Tejas gets those contracts? Talk about riding that wave.
It's a win-win, right?
Yeah.
BSNL gets a head start on 5G, and Tejas gets to show off what they can do. But that's not all. Tejas is thinking beyond just the world of telecom. They're actually in the running for a pretty big contract with Indian Railways. It's a system to prevent train collisions. We're talking about a potentially huge deal for them. Think about how big the Indian Railways network is.
It's about more than just the money, right? If they get a contract like that, it's a big vote of confidence. It shows that they can handle these massive, complex projects.
Absolutely. It's about building trust and showing that they can deliver.
And speaking of getting noticed, Tejas is making moves into the world of private 5G. I mean, they're in trials with a really big name company in India, which is huge. It's becoming more common all over the world, companies wanting their own 5G networks, more security, more control, But can Tejas, a company that's made its name working with big government players like BSNL, really make it in this world that's already got all these international big shots?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a bit of an underdog story, isn't it? Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder how they plan to compete on that kind of global scale, right? It's a whole different ballgame.
So how do they plan to do it?
Well, they talked about that in the earnings call, and they're really leaning into this idea of being super cost-effective, basically offering those top-tier solutions, but at a much better price point than anyone else, like getting those luxury features, but without the luxury price tag,
Sounds pretty gutsy. But I mean, international markets, especially in tech, they're not easy to crack, are they?
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the price. They're also really playing up the whole made in India angle, tying themselves to that and the government's push for being more self-reliant.
It's a smart move, for sure, aligning themselves with that sense of national pride, but can they really deliver that same level of quality at scale and keep the costs down?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They've got to find that sweet spot, keeping the cost benefits of producing things locally, but also getting those top-notch components and expertise. And sometimes that means looking outside their borders.
It's a tough balancing act. And speaking of balancing acts, let's circle back to their reliance on BSNL for a second. Because on the one hand, it's great, right? That contract's what's driving all this growth. But what happens if those contracts disappear?
It's a big risk, and I think they know it. Which is why I think their play for the Indian Railways is so interesting. If they snag some of those contracts, it really changes things for them. It means they're not just depending on one big client anymore, and it shows what they can do in a totally different sector.
It's like they're building a safety net, right?
Exactly. They need to show they're not just a one-trick pony.
Yeah.
And the Indian Railways, think about it, such a huge network, they need constant upgrades. It could be exactly what Tejas needs to get to that next level.
And don't forget about their little adventure into private 5G. It's either brilliant or totally crazy, right?
Think about high risk, high reward. It's like they're jumping into the Shark Tank, going up against some really big players who've been doing this for years and who have tons of money.
So why do they think they stand a chance?
Well, I think you're banking on being more agile, more customer-focused than those huge companies. Plus, being connected to the Tata Group doesn't hurt. That name carries a lot of weight, in India and outside, too.
It's like they're saying, we might be the small guy, but we're hungry and we've got the best backup in the business.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Although, let's be real, it's a long shot. They're definitely the underdog here. They're going to need a lot of luck and a lot of smarts to make this work.
And speaking of smarts, they're putting a lot of faith in some pretty cool tech, like those multi-band radios you mentioned. What are those exactly? Why are they so important?
Oh, yeah, the multi-band radios. It's like having a Swiss Army knife for wireless communication, right? They can handle a bunch of different frequencies all at the same time, which basically translates to better bandwidth, faster speeds, better coverage. And these days, everyone wants to be using those data-heavy apps, so it's pretty important stuff.
So more bandwidth, faster speeds. Sounds good to me. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the financials. The statements show they've taken on a lot of debt, mostly because of this BSNL project. Can they handle that kind of pressure?
It's something to watch, that's for sure. They're definitely walking a bit of a tightrope here. Their gamble is that the BSNL project will make them enough money to pay off that debt and still have plenty left over to keep growing.
High risk, high reward, right? So
Yeah.
if they win big, but if things go south.
Well, let's just say it could get a little messy. They'll have to be really careful with their cash flow, keep those costs down, and make sure they're getting a good return on all their investments.
I mean, it's clear Tejas Networks is at a turning point. On the one hand, they've had this amazing success, but they're also staring down some pretty big challenges. It's like the classic story of risk versus reward,
Yeah.
Big dreams, big uncertainty.
And I think that's what makes this so fascinating to dig into. We have all the puzzle pieces, but we don't know what the final picture is going to look like yet.
So they're walking this tightrope, trying to balance their ambition with some financial smarts, taking risks, going after those big wins. It's a lot. What do you think is the most important thing for them to be successful? I mean, if you had to pick one thing.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think for me, it really comes down to execution. Like, they've got these big ideas, they got a good story, and the tech is there, but if they can't make it all happen, none of that matters.
It's like having the recipe but forgetting to turn on the oven.
Exactly. You got to bake that cake. They need to take all those strategies and turn them into wins, getting those big contracts, being smart with the money, and really building up their name globally.
It's a tall order, that's for sure. But one thing I will say, they definitely don't seem to be afraid of a challenge. If anything, they're running towards them,
They're like that team that no one expects to win, but they just keep fighting.
And their plan to expand internationally, going up against those giants, it's a bold move. I mean, do you think they really get how tough it's going to be?
It's a gamble, yeah. But even David had his slingshot, right? Tejas has some things working for them, the cost thing, the whole made in India thing. And they can move faster than those big companies. They're not afraid to make partnerships. That could really help level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, those partnerships could be huge, especially as they figure out how to work in these new markets. It's like having someone who knows the lay of the land when you're in a new city.
Exactly. It's all about who you know. That local knowledge is so important.
Okay, so We've covered a lot of ground, record-breaking numbers, huge plans, some pretty cool tech that's Tejas at their best, right? But, like we've been talking about, they're facing some pretty big hurdles too. Competition, finances, and just trying to do too much at once. So, at the end of the day, what's your big takeaway?
I think Tejas Networks is at a crossroads. They've had a taste of success, but they're not satisfied. They're going for it, but they know it's risky.
High stakes, for sure.
Definitely. And we'll have to see how it all plays out. But one thing's for certain, they're not giving up without a fight. They're definitely a company to keep your eye on. I think they could really shake things up.
That's what makes it interesting, right? That we don't know what's going to happen, that they're willing to take these risks.
Absolutely. They're a perfect example of what's possible when you're willing to be innovative, determined, and just go for it.
Well said. All right, listeners, here's something to think about. Keep your ear to the ground. Watch for those earnings reports, any news about new contracts, who they're partnering with. That'll give you a sense of whether or not Tejas Networks can keep this momentum going.
Don't forget, this is just the beginning of their story.
And that's it for today's deep dive into the world of Tejas Networks. We hope you've learned a thing or two, and maybe we've even inspired you to do some exploring of your own. Until next time, keep learning and keep diving deep.